Hello, hello, hello. I hope everybody's doing well. Tonight, we actually have a good impromptu stream. We've got Praise of Folly on. Looking forward to hearing some of its thoughts on Pulp and what goes on with that, how it came about in the US, and if it's even worth digging into. So, we're going to get some definitions. We're going to talk about that and see what we can come up with. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you, Wandering Panda? I'm good. How are you, Wandering Panda?
Yeah, I was going to say I'm quite well, but my mic was off, so I had muted myself. Oh, never a dull moment. But yeah, fair enough. Doing all right. The weather out here has been a bit crazy, so been dealing with that. Been dealing with some bandwidth issues, but is what it is. So hey, the past couple, I was poking around on YouTube like I'll do, and I heard on socialism and why it didn't quite take off. I was already thinking about all that, and I said, man, that was some good stuff. And I was looking forward to talking about that one a bit, which I did last night. But then that I don't want to overstate it, but a little bit of a shit with American Pulp. So let's dig in. Tell everybody, what is the issue with American Pulp? How is it you're defining?
Yeah, so the word pulp, of course, comes from the original cheap paper it was printed on from wood pulp back in the, I guess, 20s and 30s when it got big. And of course, common big names would be like Flash Gordon, The Shadow, Doc Savage, obviously Conan. That's tonight's discussion. And while you might have, say, Sword and Sandals or sci-fi or detective, there's several themes that are consistent throughout, right? Rugged individualism, where the guy kind of goes solo and often can take on impossible odds. A kind of sensationalism, fast-paced action, over-the-top cartoonish violence, and a lot of sexual titillation. Those now they don't have to have all of those. I mean, for example, Cole the Conqueror doesn't really have a lot of the sex stuff that Conan does. Still has a lot of the violent stuff, right? So these are like you're fencing in a genre, right? You fenced it in, and now you just start throwing stuff inside the middle. That's what I would say a pulp is. It's that, and it really develops in the early industrial age, right? One of the more famous, still pretty famous, is Edgar Rice Burroughs, right? We have Tarzan. Everybody knows Tarzan. We have John Carter, Princess of Mars. Disney made a movie about John Carter, about a decade ago? So, that's sort of where it really starts to take off. And a lot of the tropes that you'll find in Conan, you'll find with Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I tried to read the first Princess of Mars book, and I couldn't finish it for the same reason I couldn't start Conan. I mean, the guy just wakes up on Mars and just wrestles down aliens. Like no, that's not how it's going to work. But okay, whatever. That's the story he's going to tell. No, that's what I would say broadly pulp is. And I think most people would agree that this creates a sort of bin that we can throw in authors and concepts and books and call that pulp.
Okay, so as we start digging into it, is the issue with pulp? Is it the thinness of the stories per se? Is one of the issues the fact that these guys, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they're sort of pushing at the edges of what's acceptable? What if there is an issue with pulp? What is that issue?
Well, I mean, there's actually a few issues I have with pulp. Well, let's start with something that's a little more accessible, right? So they're the kind of men that like pulp, and well, I mean, Howard, I guess, was probably still a man of the right in a way that Lovecraft was too. But think of like the 90s and early 2000s liberals, right? They were the ones that the men within that group, they were the ones that liked to have, the movies and the artwork of skimpy women. And then once the woke started clamping down on that with feminism, they jumped to the right again. And now they've joined the dissident right, the far right, and you have like Astalia House, right, where they're sort of publishing all this all over again, and then writing new pulp to go with the old pulp, right? And so, but in the from like 1910-ish, when like Tarzan gets started, to Howard, I think he dies in 36. The issue then becomes, what do they represent within the cultural zeitgeist of the West? They don't represent tradition, right? Because any traditionalist in the West at that time would have been aghast at the kind of casual sexual relations. So let's zero in on that. That's a left-wing idea. The idea of just casually shacking up with someone and then walking away, free love, that was a far left commie idea. So in the 19th century, the only people that argued for that were like socialists, feminists, and anarchists. That was not a right-wing position, and yet we see this time and time again in Pulp, especially Conan. He's always got a side chick, and I'm like, well, this isn't right-wing in the least. Like, anybody at that time who was right-wing would have considered this degenerate literature, and arguably proto-feminist. Like, why don't women in Pulp ever have periods or get pregnant? Like, what? Like, that's just not how the real world works. And then you're going to say, well, it's a story, bruh. Well, okay. Well, then when the wokies have their empowered, feminist hero archetypes, well, that's bad because it violates biology and physics. Whoa, back up. It cuts both ways here. You can't object to, I don't know, G.I. Jane or the, what's her name, Ridley from Aliens, and then say, well, but it's okay when Conan does it. It's the same basic principle of tearing down boundaries and identities.
Okay, so what is Pulp? Is Pulp an expression of some sort of generic Americanism, or is this some sort? Is it an American expression of vitalism? And it goes back to the Nietzschean, the Ubermensch idea of making life what you want it to be.
Well, okay, actually, that's interesting you bring this up, right? Because in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche specifically condemns this kind of thinking. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, he doesn't think a man can get much lower than to believe the goal in life is to lie with a woman. That's literally what he says. So that's not what Nietzsche would view as vitalistic. In fact, the Obermenschen, he's not necessarily puritanical and he's not necessarily Christian, but the idea that he would just have endless lines of women to sleep with is not at all in the chain at all. Nietzsche did not advocate that kind of behavior for the overman.
Yeah, and I love going down this route because then it gets pretty easy to jump into the idea of what was Christ expressing during the Beatitudes, and he's talking about being meek and what that means. And it was understood, until roughly 200 years ago that one, to be meek, you have to be capable of being other than meek, and then meekness is a controlling of the passions, not being ruled by the passions themselves.
Right.
Yeah, and so somewhere in there, in Nietzsche and people outside of Christianity, they recognize that too. Certainly, Evelo recognized it's not a base. It's not being ruled by the passions, and it is chasing after that solar and being able to pursue something other than your base form.
Now, as far as I know, I don't know Howard making any direct connection to Nietzsche. The sort of like vitalist reading of Pulp by modern day right-wing Nietzscheans is new. I don't think that was what Howard was. I don't think that was in Howard's mind as he was writing. And furthermore, it's just not a reading of Nietzsche. I mean, one of my critiques of many people, not just on the right, is people don't read. And if you read, you realize that Nietzsche doesn't have this attitude towards sex that we find in Pulp. So I would argue it's not a portrayal of vitalism.
Hey, fantastic. All right, cool. So what is okay, so we set up Howard on one point on this spectrum of Pulp, and then we've got Burroughs and we've got Lovecraft on these other points. What is the difference in there within the line, and is it even fair to, is Howard his own thing within Pulp, or is he just the most well remembered, and then these other guys are getting lumped in where maybe they shouldn't be?
Well, I think Burroughs is still well remembered. I mean, Tarzan is. I mean, there was a Tarzan movie about 10 years ago, so I think Tarzan, like Conan, still has survived the test of time in a sense. So I think, and then like I said, Princess of Mars was a movie John Carter with Disney a few years back. So I think that survives, and they would be, I think, the two classic examples. Lovecraft is not pulp, even though he was publishing weird tales because nobody else would publish them. And here's why. The difference is, just like George R. R. Martin, Lovecraft loves to kill off his protagonists. So, right, part of the idea of pulp is there's this like fictive invincibility, right? I'll just take on anything that the universe can throw at me and I'll win. Lovecraft has the exact opposite mentality. People who probe too deeply into the universe's secrets end up having a bad day. There's a few people that can survive what the old ones can throw at them by using the Necronomicon, someone like Armitage and the Dunwich Horror, but it's the exact opposite mindset. The mindset is, stay away, and if you can't stay away, find out some arcana to protect yourself. Get some swastikas, because the elder sign is actually a swastika.
Yeah, so we've been talking. We've been focused on Howard, but we've been talking a little bit in generalities. To get real specific, do you see any sort of any competition or contrast between the primary character of Conan and then the puritanical character of Solomon Kane? And what do you think was going on there, and what was Howard trying to achieve in that almost the opposite to some degree of the Conan character, but then also linked in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I've read a few Solomon Kane stories. I definitely prefer the aesthetic more, but I still find the same problem. And it's best summed up in the whole magic can't defeat magic, which was already established in the Phoenix on the Sword, which I'm sure, I don't know for sure, but since that same theme exists both in Smith's work and Lovecraft's work, I'm assuming that they at least were all inspired by the same source or cross-pollinated. And we see the same rejection of that principle. I think it was the second or third Solomon Kane story. He goes into a marsh and he just like wrestles this like demonic spirit. And again, even though he's quote a Puritan stylistically, he doesn't really have faith. He's sort of a self-made man, like most of Howard's characters, relying on his own inner strength to defeat this spiritual being. And I just, again, to me, that's the same kind of problem as Conan. Even though it doesn't have the other aesthetic trappings that I don't like, it still has this core error that one man against the world without appealing to any higher power can do this. It's just, no, I don't.
It's particularly interesting for me as well in Solomon Kane, because it sort of dives into this idea of being the righteous hand of the Lord apart from the Lord himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a lot of depth to exploring that, which frankly Howard didn't go that deep with it. But it is a visual of a man acting in that manner, and that he gets to speak, "Thus saith the Lord," without seemingly any sort of impetus from the Lord himself. So he's a curious character. I enjoy reading what little I have of Solomon Kane. But there is this tension that rests there within the story.
Yeah, well, I think it's also helpful to contrast pulp. So let's have on the one hand, we've got Burroughs and Howard, the two classic pulp authors with Tarzan and Conan. And then Jack London and Rudyard Kipling. Now, Jack London and Rudyard Kipling wrote tons of adventure stories. And even from the point of view of the animals, like Call of the Wild, which was a dog for Jack London, and Rikki Tikki Tavi, a mongoose, which is Kipling. And these are men of action and adventure. They've been around the world, they've traveled, they can write from their own experiences and the experiences of others. And yeah, that's exciting, that's fun. And pulp tries to tap into that. But it's a very superficial way, because if you read Jack London, you don't have a guy going out and like fighting 25 Indians by himself. He doesn't do that. Whereas, Conan wouldn't bat an eye. Tarzan wouldn't bat an eye. Or Tarzan fights more animals, so he'll wrestle a gorilla. I mean, a gorilla's 800 pounds. The most Tarzan could weigh is 200. That just ain't going to happen. You're not going to wrestle down a gorilla. And London doesn't write about wrestling down gorillas or in the North American context, bears. Nor does Kipling. And it's like it creates this sort of like childish escapism where it's like what's wrong with feminist literature, leftist literature, the transgender movement? through the art of movies and books and TV shows, people have been have seeded this imaginary universe with impossible concepts. Impossible concepts that we all in the right know can never be manifested. And it becomes annoying dealing with these people because they expect things that can't actually ever happen. But we have to put up with it because they live in the same world we do. Well, where does this idea start where you create this like parallel fantasy universe where you populate it with impossible realities? It starts with Pulp. You're not going to wrestle an 800-pound gorilla. You're not going to go out and, fight 50 warriors against one unless you have divine power, which, in myths and legends, that's exactly what happened. A god, a demon, whatever, possessed this warrior and he had this power. Well, that's different. We're talking about something totally different here, but just, on your own steam. And it creates an expectation that just can never be. And it's like, it's cooler because it's macho and masculine, but it's the same basic mistake that the feminists and the liberal, the Star Trek and the transgender person makes when they invent this fantasy world that can never be.
Okay, so let's really go nuts here. Is Pulp potentially a continuation of a Protestant and Puritan mindset? In that, what's that?
No.
Okay.
Well, but I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish your point. I thought you were done.
Well, no worries. Frankly, I haven't. It's sort of off the top of my head, but it is this question. Protestantism, seemingly to me, it forces you to be able to create utopianism, in that once God is knowable, once God is able to be systematically delved into, you almost get to a point where either God has to become bigger than your knowledge, or often you'll see within different, particularly Reformed ideas, that there almost comes a split where people end up, we'll just say, walking away from the church because God is completely knowable. And so then you have to create this sort of utopianism to keep God to his word. And so I wonder sometimes if we can make that argument when it comes to pulp and media, this idea that because we've known God and because we've been able to systematically define what God is and what he's doing, when he doesn't act in the way he's supposed to, when he doesn't provide the justice we're expecting and so on, then we know that it's our task to act as the hand of God, i.e. Solomon, Cain, and so on. But again, that's just running off the top of my head here. So I'm curious your thoughts on any of that.
Well, no, for two reasons. Because the problem with Tarzan and Conan is specifically they do not have divine power. Which, if this were the result of a religious mind, you would see them invoking the power of some god or demon or spirit, which they don't do. But then, more to the point, the Reformed Christianity is in the opposite direction of Conan. Conan is an unshackling of all male desires without limit, whereas the Calvinist is the opposite. God is, from his mindset, everything is shackled down, and you're just an unworthy worm that God decided to one day take compassion on. So
herein lies total depravity.
Right. So that's the exact opposite of Conan. Conan is ultimately very pagan, in the sense that there is no sense of guilt or shame or total depravity.
Sure. I guess sort of what I was wondering and thinking about, if and this also gets into arguments over whether or not American ideas and American expressions, particularly liberal ideas, are the post-Christian reality of Puritanism. And that's an argument in itself.
But I mean, Conan isn't liberal, though.
What's that?
But Conan isn't liberal, though. He's the opposite.
Well, sure, but in either way, it's this transcendence of God, and therefore becoming God.
I don't see the connection between this and Conan.
Fair enough. So, fair enough. Uh, very good. Okay, so we've got Conan, and then there was something else in there. So you've hinted, or I'm sorry, not hinted, but you have explained the idea of divinity and that being intertwined. Achilles is this demigod, quasi god, however we want to describe that, and certainly the divine is interacting in there. Um, where where has pulp gone? Has it been transformed? Has it been killed? Or is feminism still the stakeholder of pulp, and therefore the lack of divinity?
Well, I mean, this is what's interesting, right? Because if we look at pulp, we don't really know at the time. At least I don't know at the time what like the parallel feminist movement thought. Think of like say the flappers in the 1920s with prohibition, or the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
A lot of the women in these pulp sound like modern women. I mean, they really do feel like these modern American women. Now, some of it is set in the modern United States, like noir and detectives, but some of it's set into the future with sci-fi, and some in the far past with like Conan or Cull or something like that. And I'm like, this is just kind of the free sexually available woman. How is this not feminism?
Yeah. And I think I'm trying. I'm going off my memory here, but I don't believe we'll say grape. I don't believe grape is ever an occasion in any of the fiction we're talking about right now. I think there's always a willingness on that part, and like you said, the open sexuality, the encouraged feminism, the woman of choice, so to speak.
Right, because you got to remember, and I think I didn't read Red Nails, but Valeria shows up there, and then she shows up in the Ronnie movie. I mean, she teams up with Conan. Conan doesn't coerce her. She wants to be with Conan as much as he wants to be with her. And on top of being free and available, like her and Red Sonja, you also have the action heroine, which, I mean, how is this just got the strong, empowered woman vibe? Just in a 1930s style. And, maybe the reason why Anita Sarkeesian doesn't like that anymore is because reasons. I mean, I don't know why she'd be unhappy. It seems like what they want.
Yeah, well, never trust a feminist for consistency, and I suppose the same goes for a pulp writer.
But I'm serious here, though. How is pulp not just OG feminism? Now, obviously, it's from the male point of view, but
Yes.
But still,
Well, and I think maybe a more broad application would just be it is a libertine approach, and so more than just the feminist and the masculine. It's just a libertine approach to life, which ultimately is a brash materialism.
well, right.
It even
Go ahead.
I was going to say, well, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, in that it denies even a Nietzschean, a Volian idea of conquering your life and making it what it is supposed to be. It just engages in whatever is available at the lowest common denominator.
Now let's compare. Let's go back real quick to the Iliad. Somebody might say, "Well, the Iliad's full of violence and killing and sex implied," because the whole spat with Agamemnon begins over one of the war bride captives. Rule number one: there's gods involved. This changes everything. Achilles has divine aid all the time. So, of course, his exploits are in a totally different category than Conan's. But second of all, he still suffers. He still eventually dies at the hands of Paris because he flouts the gods, hubris, right? Conan doesn't suffer from hubris. In fact, he says in The Queen of the Black Coast that, Crom is Crom, whatever. I don't really care about Crom. He's sort of the titular deity of my people, but not. I mean, that kind of, or in the Arnie movie, and he has that prayer, if you don't give me victory in battle, then damn you, Crom. Like, nobody in the Iliad would say that. Oh, hey, Zeus, damn you, Zeus. No, Zeus would strike it with a lightning bolt. I mean, there's no way they'd say that. And then second of all, the women in the Iliad are not independent women making their own choice in a sexual liaison. They're captives. So again, this is just feminism. I don't see how this isn't feminism.
Yeah, well, and I'm just thinking. I mean, everything we can make it general and say divinity, like you were talking about in the Iliad, and how Homer would have understood that, and how the hearers of the primary epics, how they would have heard and interpreted things. And certainly, the argument can be made, I think, then that pulp is one of the first very accessible and very produced. I don't not produced in that it had high production standards, but it was easily available. You walk into your store and find it. You know, it's one of the first post-Christian expressions here within the United States of simple stories and base materialism. And
Yeah, that's more capitalism then.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that unfortunately that does put a very cynical spin on Howard, because it gets down to the point of if nothing is being achieved, and I think you mentioned this too, that nothing is ever at stake, then what's the point? What is being achieved here other than a writer saying, you know, here's a sitcom, here's something fun that you can enjoy, and you know, we'll go on to the next one in the next issue.
Yeah, yeah, and so now Lovecraft, of course, didn't really make a lot of money publishing his works. In fact, he had to have people help preserve his work, including Clark Ashton Smith. Another reason why he should be well known is he helped continue the legacy of Lovecraft from preventing it from being forgotten. The irony is now Smith is forgotten, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, for sure. So you've already talked about it a little bit. We've talked about the Iliad. How do we? Is there? Let me make it even more simple. Is there anything valuable to be gained from reading Howard, from reading Burroughs, from reading? Let's keep Lovecraft out because we've already talked about that. But from pulp in general, is there anything worthwhile, or should it just be stepped over?
Well, for like a literary sense, it should just be stepped over. I don't see any use in pulp. But there is one thing in which pulp can be useful. Lots of men read it, and by extension, it did influence women as well because they reacted against it. It does help explain how we got here as a country. It is a historical artifact that does explain how people's beliefs were shaped over time. Because one of the things that I realized when I watched all the reaction videos to Anita Sarkeesian back in the day when that was all the rage is almost all of the tropes she was attacking were tropes that had their origin in pulp. And she didn't really engage with, I don't know, say like the Arthurian cycle or something like that. That's way above Anita's pay grade, right? And it's like, well, okay, so that would indicate to me that whatever her audience is a bunch of women who've had experience with a bunch of guys who read pulp. And I'm like, okay, so there's that feedback loop there. So it does explain to us how people's beliefs were shaped over time, and in that regard, it is important historically.
Fair enough. Yeah. So just to recap, the differences between pulp and London, I would make the argument McMurtry. You know, I was being a little bit cheeky with the thumbnail that I did. You've got McMurtry, you've got London, you've got Kipling, you've got guys who are writing fast, they're writing action, they're writing violence, and they're not necessarily digging into a whole bunch of theory, but you can see some sort of transcendence, some sort of higher value that can be formed within their writing. Yeah. And so, yep. With that, I think that was good. I appreciate you explaining that it wasn't so much the writing style as it was the actual content.
Yeah, and one other thing I'd like to add too is London. I use a lot as a really good point counterpoint because again, I love adventure and action stories that are based on something more real. So, for example, in White Fang, the dog sees men as gods, and so his instinct tells him to not attack men unless he's defending other men. Okay, if Conan is a creature of instinct, his instinct would tell him not to fight the dark gods, at least not without magical assistance within Hyperborea, which he just completely doesn't do. And it's like, well, that's not instinct. Instinct would tell you not to do that. And again, White Fang is seen as this dog who's absolutely a beast. He's a unit because of his rough upbringing in nature. So that'd be the equivalent of growing up in Chimera. But there's certain things the dog isn't going to do, because it's like, yeah, I'm tough by nature, but I'm not going to do all that. So yeah, that's ultimately where I think he fails. It's kind of like not delivering on the goods. It's like, well, if White Fang were a man, he'd be Conan, and it's like, yeah, but Conan doesn't act like the way you'd expect.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking, I went last summer and I reread Call of the Wild, and it was interesting now to read it as a little bit older age and have a little bit more literature under my belt, and just realize this is Baby's first epic. This is Junior's first epic that he can read of a character who you see the divinity in there. You see the ideas and the creeping up of the grand narrative within the Call of the Wild, and then you have the various trials and tribulations that he is able to overcome, just barely sometimes, and so there's a difference there between that and a random adventure where there are no stakes.
Well, yeah. Also, in White Fang is almost killed in a dogfight by a bulldog, and it takes the assistance of a human. I think he's a cartographer to step in and save him. So he can't. There's a hard limit where, like, okay, if this human doesn't step in, he's dead. Conan doesn't really have that kind of stake. There's where somebody steps in and says, well, without my help, you're just not going to make it. Which see what it does to the male reader, especially in the United States, because stakes are relatively low, is it creates this perverse individualism where you can just go it alone, and you don't need other people to help you. It's like, well, no, actually you do. And I thought tradition was all about, building communities and reforging these lost clan ties, not tearing them up in hyper individualism.
Yeah, and I don't want to kick a person while they're down, but I do think you made an interesting connection when we look at the life of Howard and how that ultimately ended. And it was this, it was a potential refutation of different ideas that could come about when you're reading Pulp, especially Conan and characters like that. And so again, I don't want to hit that too hard, but I think there is the potential to make that connection.
Well, yeah, and also back to your money interest thing, there was a biopic documentary film called The Whole Wide World, which came out in 1996, about the life of Robert E. Howard and his, I guess, girlfriend, Novelyn Price. And it was based on her testimony about Conan. And throughout the film, he's like, yeah, I'm just writing what the people want. They want money, and I want money, and they want violence and sex. So I put it in my books. He says that all the time in the film. And that seems to be based on the testimony of Novelyn Price. So, again.
Yep, fair enough. All right, well, good. So I don't want to cut you off if you have any other thoughts on Pulp or anything that we've sort of touched on today. So you tell me.
Well, I think there's a few more things we could do, because you also mentioned, like, what's the cause of this? We've already sort of agreed on the finance angle, right? You've got to publish materials, you got to sell at the bookstore, just that pressure keeps going. But the other thing is there's a kind of industrialized quality to life that Conan exhibits, but needless to say, Hyperborea doesn't have the material conditions to have an industrial society. So, for example, one of the things that people expect is this sort of like fast-paced punchiness is because an industrial society is fast paced and punchy. Things are happening all the time. And, especially even in our own lifetimes in the last 20 years, people are like, man, if you don't get on board, you're going to get left behind. And so that kind of attitude towards life cannot exist in Hyperborea. It does not have the material conditions to allow for that kind of life. So let's think about, like, again.
I'm enjoying this line of thought. Tell me if I'm picking up what you're putting down. For them to have swords, for them to be able to survive winter, for these civilizations to exist, there has to be this communal, long outlook, low time preference.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
That's a big part of it, yeah.
All right. This is great. Yeah. Go on.
So this gets into my critique of technology and EROI. So again, the concept of EROI, energy return on investment, is rooted in a study of biological systems. So let's say you're a predator and you have to make a certain amount of kills in order to recoup the energy you spent hunting. Well, if you have a 1-to-1 or 1 to less than 1, you're in an energy sink and then you'll die. So the predator has to consume more energy than he consumes. Now, here's the problem. If you're going full tilt all the time, that ain't going to work. I asked Grok, I said, okay, Grok, let's say you're a lion. I mean, what are you doing most of the time? You're not hunting. He's like, yeah, probably like 5% hunting and the rest just like, loafing around. It's like, yeah. I mean, so if you watch a nature documentary and all the lion does is loaf around, that's kind of boring. So by watching all these nature shows, we get this like high octane version of like shark attacks and lion attacks. And it's like, that's like 5% of their lives. But we have this illusion that they're living in this like breakneck speed, high octane life. When they can't, like the energy levels won't allow that to happen. In Hyperborea, there isn't enough energy in the system for this kind of high octane action to be happening all the time. It's just not possible. Conan will be dead from just EROI exhaustion. And it's like, this is an industrial mindset being superimposed on antiquity. And it just doesn't, it's a huge mismatch.
Yeah. And that's to go for the cheap shot and compare Howard to Tolkien. That's sort of the idea, or excuse me, one of the major ideas being expressed within Lord of the Rings is that this was a building issue. So that year and a half of what we see, and we can argue that it's even longer than that if you take the separation in time between Gandalf being introduced to the idea that Bilbo has the One Ring and then him finally coming back and grabbing Frodo and starting all this. This is a moment in time that has been reached apart from the everyday life and the investment by the different races into their different civilizations and into their creation of reality. It's so, and actually let me not walk that back, but sidestep that a little bit and say, I've said it before, but you guys need to go and listen to Folly's stream on the End of War. He digs into this idea even more, in that the idea that sustained combat is an impossibility. It's an absurdity. And so while you and I might have some slight tweaks and variations, I think that's one of the things that people have to get through their head. We have the whole prepper and doomer and these ideas, and we have to remember that destruction, combat, and sin itself is unsustainable. And even if you don't want to say sin in the Christian sense, acting apart from nature, acting apart from monitoring and harvesting energy is an absolute impossibility. It is unsustainable.
Yeah. And of course, given the setting of Conan and Hyperborea, it's just even more impossible. Or Tarzan and the darkest jungles of Africa. This is just totally impossible. Both for their the human heroes themselves and their animal or monster opponents. They see, the Lord of the Rings is pretty. The actual pacing for the characters is pretty slow, except for a few punctuated action moments, like the Watcher, the fight at in Moria, Helm's Deep, and then Pelennor Fields. But most of the time, they're just walking around talking, which is what people are going to do in a low-tech society. See, if you're like a Navy SEAL, you got PEDs, you've got stimulants to stay up, like coffee or some synthetic material, and you're being inserted with a chopper. You have all these energy inputs that allow you to live this high-octane life that Conan doesn't have, and frankly, Howard didn't have in Texas, right? Even this was just getting started in the 30s. So this is just a completely fantastic cartoonish view of life at any time prior to industrial civilization, which just cannot be. It literally just cannot be based on thermodynamics.
Yeah, well, and somebody who comes at it from practical experience, the idea of combat that we end up seeing in any of the movies and the comic books, the pulp of this age, is exactly what you said. It's totally unsustainable, and not only is it unsustainable, it's completely unrealistic. There is a reason "hurry up and wait" is the unofficial motto of all four branches of the military.
I mean, when I used to watch World War II documentaries, they would say that sailors in the Pacific said that life was 95% boredom and 5% excruciating terror.
Yeah.
So again, that's even in an industrial war. That's World War II in the Pacific. So even then, it's still not that action packed. And so
I can tell you, as an infantry guy, that the most. So I'm going out on patrol. I'm running PSD and QRF and all that, and the most amount of time I ever put into Munchkin the card game was when I was deployed.
Oh, that's great. That's good. No, but my point is,
yeah, dude, it was dangerous. We nearly came to blows playing that game sometimes.
No, but the point is though, I would then, well, we're running the Eroy angle here, right? Well, what's the Eroy on reading Conan? I want an Eroy number for this.
Yeah. Well, and I think intuitively, even as a kid, you sort of know this. And so I've told you before, there was a time where my grandfather died, and that's a whole nother story in itself. At this point when he dies, he is a grown man. He is relatively young. He hadn't retired, but he has thousands of comics in his apartment. And so he dies, and we get all these comic books as little kids, and a big portion of that, say roughly 20%, was Conan and Red Sonja and Cull. And I'm reading these as a kid, which frankly I probably shouldn't have, but whatever. I have all these Conan comics, and I'm working through them. And even as a kid, it's this idea of there's always this reset button at the end of the story. And so regardless of how much love he receives or the fights that he's in and the lands that he procures, there's always this this reset button that saves all the resources he has expended, but it also negates anything that he has earned. And even as a kid, it's like you can't quite communicate that, but there's an absurdity there.
Yes.
That doesn't negate the fun, because and looking back now, I mean, that's all it was fun. But there wasn't this overarching narrative that was capable of being sustained, because it was just a thin here's the adventure.
Well, here's the point, right? So obviously literature, even literature that we would say is fiction in the sense that it's not necessarily meant to be taken as a literal historical event, but is at least representing real concepts. Let's just say from Homer to London. None of these authors thought it would be a good idea to write about men who could ignore biological limits and the limits of physics. And the question is, why? Well, because that literature was meant to be not only entertaining, but edifying. It was meant to instruct you as to how the world worked. So if you read Jack London, and you wanted to go out in the wild at that time, I mean, you'd have some basic ideas, right? You'd have some basic understanding of what's going out there, rather than, reading. If you read a Conan story, what does that prepare you for? Nothing. It prepares you for nothing. Whereas if you read Jack, I mean, like his story to start a fire, the guy goes out in minus 70-degree weather alone, ignoring all the advice of the older trail hands, and he freezes to death. That's a cautionary tale. Don't do that. But apparently Conan never freezes to death, so I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I had something there, and well, I'm kind of diverging a little bit, but the one book I've read by London that gets a little like, I don't know, man. But I give him grace on this because one, he's good on his other books, and in this one he was almost proto exploration. But the Iron Heel, there's a little bit of momentum in there that I'm not sure they would be able to carry on that way.
I like the Iron Heel. What did you think about it?
So I did enjoy it. What were specifically the ground battles there towards the end? I felt like there had been such a theory build up in the beginning that it almost seemed like he lost his way there at the very end, say the last sixth of the book.
Oh, you mean the battle for Chicago? Fighting.
Yep.
Well, I mean, he hadn't he hadn't gone to war and fought in a city, but what did you think was unbelievable about the Battle of Chicago?
It wasn't strictly plot armor, but the spy counter spy narrative and the looking over the shoulder. There was some things in there that just it's hard to put it completely. It's hard for me to communicate as well right now, but
I just thought that
it rang convenient and like he was tapping on plot armor.
It's possible, but the really worst Jackson story, London story, and really does exhibit all of the worst elements of Pulp, is his story called Goliath, where this like mad scientist finds a MacGuffin device. So he's a socialist, mad scientist, finds a MacGuffin device, which he calls Energon. I have no idea if Transformers ever heard about this. That's really weird. But and then he uses it to just stop all the world governments from fighting, forcing them to become socialist. It's a very badly written story where this guy has this magical tool that it can just make all the world governments bow to him. Because I mean, at least in the Iron Heel, right, when there's the war between Germany and America, they both go on strike, ending the war. I mean, they've put in effort. They have to coordinate all the labor movements. This is just Goliath's terrible. I mean, you should read it.
Yeah,
just because it's terrible, but. Even Jack London wasn't immune from this kind of writing. It's unfortunate, but by and large, he avoids it.
Right. Well, and that's fair. I mean, frankly, the case can be made that Tolkien, up until his death, was making changes to his greater canon, his legendarium, and what we have now, post his death, thanks to Christopher, is a version of the Silmarillion. And Christopher Tolkien's all like, look, I did the best I could. So here's what we got. And I think that, now we're totally off subject, but I think it's good. I think, we need to recognize that these guys they're creatives, they're writers, and they are attempting something that most people, frankly, couldn't even come near achieving. But yeah, they're still, even within their own canons, there's greater and lesser works.
Well, and since you brought up Papa Tolkien, everybody should.
I don't think I can make a stream without bringing up Tolkien.
Well, no. You see, ultimately, what he does is he creates what's called the true myth. So a good example of this, expressed right as an idea. So C.S. Lewis in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader sort of gives a little Easter egg as to why he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the whole Narnia cycle in the first place. So You are two old children, said Aslan, and you must begin to come close to your own world now. Isn't it Narnia, you know, sobbed Lucy. It's you. We shan't meet you there. And how can we live, never meeting you? But you shall meet me, dear one, said Aslan. Are you there too, sir? Said Edmund. I am, said Aslan, but I there have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. That was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me there better. That's why Lewis wrote Narnia. That's why Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. You go into these, quote, fantasy worlds, experience the same truths that you have here in a way that's different and exciting, so that you can then re-enter our world and then put them into use. So there's a threefold step to this process: real world, fantasy world to highlight principles, return to the real world. What Pulp does, it says real world, fantasy, and never come back. Just stay there, guys. Just stay there, never come back. And it's like, well, that's only two steps. You got to finish the loop here, buddy.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that leads into something that I had heard attributed to Gary Gygax, the D&D creator. And so as I read it, he was never a big fan of Tolkien. He thought he kind of wandered around. He didn't quite understand what he was trying to achieve. And he said, hey, on the other hand, you've got Howard and these pulp writers, and this is great. You can jump in, you're fighting, you're slaying, and you're just having a grand adventure. And without making this a critique of D&D, I mean, that is sort of the idea, that you go on this grand adventure and then you just leave it there. Never the two shall meet. Nothing deeper, nothing that can be pulled into reality.
Yes. And that is the problem, right? And I think what Gygax is expressing here is a kind of like the sort of shallow, materialist, trivial, commercialized American conception of life. It's like you just don't understand the sort of heroic or the spiritual.
Yeah, and that's, boy, is that unfortunate. You know, and that's, I mean, if we want to sort of jump in, McMurtry, have you read Lonesome Dove?
No.
Okay. I'm of the mind that Lonesome Dove should be read by every man. So ultimately, after having written that, he wrote 3 more stories within what would become the Lonesome Dove saga. The first 2, I think, are skippable. It's not that they're bad; they're just skippable. But then Lonesome Dove is very much at the peak of your life. What is it you're achieving? What's driving you? And then the last one, Streets of Laredo, is how does a man finish at life? What does that look like? And come to find out, you know, the argument is McMurtry, when he first wrote Lonesome Dove, he was writing it as the anti-Western, and to say, look how evil this was, look how lousy life west of the Mississippi was. And instead, people took that and they read it and they said, my goodness, you are writing about men trying to achieve something. You are writing about the tensions within female and male dynamics, and you're writing about fathers and sons and how those dynamics play out. And so in the midst of that, you see things that are worth considering and that can be pulled into life. And not for the first time, I lost where I was going.
Well, but the point is, though, that I'm given that almost everything in pulp you can't actually reproduce in life because it's entirely fake. What can be reproduced? And I think, unfortunately, the legacy of pulp is a kind of looking out for number one individualism. Well, are you going to help me? Do I derive some profit or utility from this transaction? I don't. Well, then I'm not going to help you, because that's about the only thing you can take from a pulp PI or Conan is just like, they're very, egoistic. They're very, is this profitable to me? Are you going to help me out here? And if you don't, well, sorry, not going to help you.
Well, I will say, so here in the past couple weeks, I was at the bookstore and I happened to see The Right Hand of Doom and Other Tales of Solomon Kane. And so I grabbed it, and I haven't jumped into it just yet. I had every intention of doing it, but you at this point have put a very dark spot over Pulp. I think you have convinced me that it is yeah, almost less than meaningless. It is a net negative.
Well, like for example, I'm going to be honest here, right? I never liked Pulp, but when I started I actually liked the idea stylistically of Solomon Kane. So I started reading the Howard stories in wanting to. I mean, I didn't want to like Conan. I never liked Conan as a character, but Solomon Kane, I did want to like because I wanted to see how you could tell a story, an adventure story with a Puritan aesthetic, and ultimately the same basic problems of Pulp reassert themselves. You know, one man going it alone without divine help, overcoming spirits and demons. Like, how? How are you doing this? Like, you don't have the capabilities to do this unless you have a magical artifact or you have some other spirit helping you. It's just like it just didn't work. And I actually came into Solomon Kane wanting to like it, so it wasn't like a self-fulfilling prophecy with, like, say, some of the other Pulp. I just think Pulp just doesn't measure up.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So what's next for you? What are you digging into? And what other spicy takes can we expect here in the next month or so?
Well, I think on Thursday,
or keep it in the bag. Keep your cards close to your chest if you'd like.
Well, one thing that I will say is I've been doing a lot of duo shows with Florian. He was introduced to my roundtable a few months back, and we're exploring the intersection of faith and science. And he's coming at this from a more science perspective, interested because he's professionally trained as a biologist, and he's more interested in learning about how science and faith intersect. So we've already had about a month of content working together, and that looks like it's a very fruitful dialogue. So we'll probably keep doing more of that.
All right, fantastic. So you tell me, have we strained it out? Do we have a good handle on Pulp?
Well, let's see. Is there anything else I want to add to Pulp? There's one more thing I want to add, and I think we'll
please
round it out. So, as I said in my critique of Conan video, there's something in Conan that draws you in because it feels real, and there is something that feels real, but it's a trick. So I quote from Sign of the Times by Carlyle, where he says that people think that minds relate to other minds like bodies relate to other bodies. You know, 10 men are stronger than one man. Yeah, sure. But he's like, minds don't work that way. One mind with a new insight, a new ideal, is stronger than all the other minds on the earth. And that kind of like all-encompassing, all-conquering masculine power does not exist in the physical world. It exists in the mental world. But Conan is a physical, material expression of this spiritual reality. So what happens is Howard got his signals crossed. So there is this esoteric truth he's getting at, but he's looking at it backwards.
Okay.
Did you see that?
Yeah, run through that one again, because I think I frankly missed exactly how deep that was. Okay, so he got his signals crossed on making it material rather than recognizing the I don't want to say subliminal. Go ahead, run that one again.
Yeah, so I'll read Carlyle directly. Maybe this will help.
Okay.
This is from his book Signs of the Times. He says, we figure society as a machine, and that mind is opposed to mind as body is to body, whereby 2 or at most 10 little minds must be stronger than one great mind. Notable absurdity, for the plain truth, very plain we think, is that minds are opposed to minds in quite a different way, and one man that has a higher wisdom, a heretofore unknown spiritual truth in him, is stronger not than 10 men that have it not, or than 10,000, but than all men that have it not, and stands among them with quite ethereal angelic power, as with a sword out of heaven's own armory, sky tempered, which no buckler and no tower of brass will finally withstand. So what's Carlyle saying? The higher truth is more powerful than everybody else.
Oh yeah, I mean this is Jesus.
Yeah, And so
Yep.
and so he's saying that the mistake is to conflate the two, right? Minds don't work like bodies and vice versa. So this higher truth, so Conan's indomitable spirit to conquer in stories is a uh, partial expression of this, but it's in a materialistic sense, which Carlyle would, of course, reject as impossible. It should be expressed spiritually, but it's not. But so Howard is getting his signals across. He is tapping into some deep esoteric truth, but it's kind of muddied in the delivery.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So this is, well, actually, I'm wrong. I was going to make this a contrast between Alexander and Buddha, or Alexander and Christ, something along those lines. But actually, I don't think that's entirely fair to Alexander or to Caesar, frankly, to most of the great generals, because, who is it that? There's a Lee quote, I think, just like barely in the back of my head, and I can't quite pull it out. But it is this idea that generals are not only in a physical sense and in a purely material sense, but also in the idea of being capable of not only, but acting according to the ideal, and being able to produce in the material that spiritual, that mental, those grand ideas.
Well, yeah. So, for example, Alexander the Great's tutor was Aristotle. So,
yes, yeah.
Well, he wasn't just a chuck.
Yeah, and not for nothing. There is something when he sits there and says, you can argue the historicity of this a little bit, but if that he said that he came from Achilles' blood, that is not just a braggadocio. It's also the blood of gods flows through me. My forefathers are greater than my forefathers are accomplishing. They are doing.
Well, we also see this in the Arthurian cycle, where the greatest knight is eventually Sir Galahad, and Sir Galahad duels with Lancelot. But what does Galahad have that Lancelot doesn't? He has a higher spiritual truth, and this is like the only time Lancelot loses in a joust. It's because he goes up against his son, who possesses a higher spiritual truth.
Beautiful. Yep. Yeah, and therein is that true myth.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
And I also want to, like you said, you don't want to kick Howard down because of the way he checked out. This isn't a let's dunk on Howard. It's like I'm criticizing his work because I think his work has a lot of deleterious consequences. Howard's life or trauma he was going through. That's not, I'm not doing that.
Yeah. Well, it is a question. What are the assumptions? I mean, it's the same thing we're going to do with humor or anybody else. Is what is it that got the wheels going and put these things into motion? And so it's not an attack on the person per se, but trying to understand what it is that was being accomplished and where that motion, where that energy came from.
Yeah. So now I think I've said all I have to say.
Okay. Well, man, always a pleasure. And,
well, yeah, thanks. It's always great.
Oh, yeah. Well, frankly, you hit on big ideas. You're able to come on here and express them, and I appreciate that. And, this is, I'm saying it with a smile on my face and a wink in my eye. But Pulp it's a little miniature shibboleth within our circles, and so it's a question of like, is it really worthwhile? What is it we're working through when we're messing with this stuff, or is it purely garbage? Is it white bread and honey or something? Well, not even honey. But
No, white bread and Splenda.
There we go. There we go. Yeah, yeah. But
No,
awesome. Hey,
white bread, margarine, and Splenda. There we go. Oh.
yeah. Yeah, well, so fair enough too. Let's really shake a stick at Pulp and say it is the Sneed oil of literature.
Yes, it is. Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So, hey Todd, go ahead and do some shilling. I know I've talked up. Frankly, again, guys, I beat a dead horse, but the end of war stream it's not just combat and the end of war, but Folly's on there. He's digging into these ideas of energy and sustainment and what is even possible in this 21st century and a little bit beyond. Where is it that we're moving towards? Definitely worth looking into that. And then, like I said, I've appreciated your last one on socialism here in the States, and then this Pulp one was great. A lot of ideas that were approached, and so it's good. Yeah. It's good. Give us some shilling.
Yeah, well, again, I'm Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. You can definitely check out the Praise of Fly podcast. Tomorrow, I'll have a roundtable where I'll discuss with Florian and Keith the cultural and political impacts of the New Atheist movement. Like, what was their what was their impact on the country, and what was maybe their real purpose. And the roundtables are always great. It looks like for the foreseeable future, Thursdays will be Florian and I talking about how faith and science interact and connect. That's fun. Tuesday is kind of a grab bag, or I just talk about whatever I feel like. And that's what's on the horizon right now.
All right. Awesome. Well, you guys can also find both of us on X. Todd's going to be on there, POF podcast. And then everything's linked in the description. And I hope you guys are having a good one. And we will see you later.